Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Mary Field and Vincent deP Goubeau lecture on women's contributions to church and society. I'm happy to introduce Sister Ann Kilbride, a member of our community who will be speaking tonight. I first met Sister Ann 13 years ago when I was working in campus ministry in Ohio Dominican University, and she was the prioress of the St. Mary of the Springs Dominicans. Since then, her congregation has joined with others to become the Dominican Sisters of Peace. She served in congregational leadership during the transition and has continued to serve in leadership roles as assistant to the president for Dominican Mission at Albertus Magnus College and in serving as interim president last year. She previously served in Parish Family Life ministry, teaching, and educational administration. Sister Ann holds a master's in theology and pastoral ministry from Notre Dame and Boston College. It's my pleasure to welcome her as she addresses the topic, Speak as if you have a million voices, St. Catherine of Siena, a leader for our time.
I can say I knew Jen when. Before I begin, just a little connection when Father Jordan mentioned Father Lawrison Riggs. When the sisters started Albertus in 1925, Father Riggs was on the advisory committee at Albertus, and he helped put together the first chapel there. And he also helped the sisters acquire art for some of the buildings over the years. So he was certainly a great leader here, but he also was very instrumental there. So you never know the connections that we have that go on and on and on. So to begin, speak as if you had a million voices. It is silence that kills the world. These words of Catherine of Siena certainly ring true when we look at history. They also ring true when we look at Catherine's life, which we celebrate today, her feast day, and in the role of a leader in today's world. For me, the wisdom of Catherine has been an inspiration and a guide as I have navigated various joys and challenges of leadership over the years. See this white hair? I've earned them. Last Sunday, I saw the musical Crown at Longwharf. The experience of this play was a tapestry of musical styles from one generation to another. More importantly, the experience of this play was a reminder of the strengths and bondedness of women forming community with their hats and their Sunday best to bring about healing in a young, broken girl and set her on a direction of wholeness, able to claim her inner strength to become a leader in her own community. Is this not what the words of Catherine can inspire in us and assist us in forming our own leadership as we strive to nurture the next generation, as these women so powerfully did in that play? I'm going to begin with just a brief synopsis and context of the life of Catherine of Siena. I know Elizabeth Dreyer gave a wonderful talk, I was here, on Catherine a few years ago. Catherine was born in 1347, the 23rd child of her parents. Imagine that. Her father was a cloth dyer, and the family, although not wealthy, was comfortable. As a child, Catherine was illiterate, yet she was a learner, as can be attested by her written legacy of prayers, letters, and the dialogue. The dialogue is her diary with God. God speaks to her, and she speaks to God. As a young woman, Catherine decided to dedicate her life to God as a Dominican Montellata, or laywoman. After becoming a Montellata, Catherine spent 3 years at home in prayer and contemplation, and during that time developed a great love of Christ through the Gospels and a great love of St. Dominic. A Dominican motto is contemplate and share with others the fruits of your contemplation. This was the journey of Catherine. After this time of prayer and contemplation, she was moved to live the life of a contemplative in action. And she writes in her dialogue, And God is speaking to her in this quote: "I have no intention of parting you from myself, but rather of making sure to bind you to me all the closer by the bond of your love for your neighbor. Remember that I have laid down 2 commandments of love of me and love of your neighbor. It is the justice of these 2 commandments that I now want you, Catherine, to fulfill. On 2 feet, you must walk my way." And so she did. Now, on your table are some quotes from Catherine. I'd like you just to read the quotes. Somebody at the table can read them. And just have a brief 2-3-minute discussion on how this quotation is meaningful to you today, so that we get into a little bit of the mind and heart of Catherine before we see what her leadership meant. We'll then just have a little simple sharing of the gathered wisdom. So have a little reading and just a little discussion at your table. I'll be back in a minute or 2. Okay, I'm going to ask you to kind of bring your attention back. And is anybody at table willing to share one of their quotes and a little bit about what you talked about with that quote? Any brave souls? The sisters to the rescue.
Yeah, well, we had the quote, "Do not be satisfied with little things, but because God wants great things." So we began to have a discussion about, well, what are the great things that God asks of us? And some of us thought, well, the great things are things that you don't start out to do that are great, but things come your way. And sometimes you don't think you can do it, but somehow you do something great. And so that's where we were in our dialogue. What are the great things? And that is God is calling us to.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else?
I'll say something. Is it on? Okay, so we were talking about the little things versus big things. But what I said was, because I see that, say, like in the work that I do, that's something that may be a little thing for me, for that person receiving it could be huge.
That's right.
So I think it's not really making a judgment about, it's just like the doing, because the other one is about, what's the other one? No, actually, it's the thing about the 2 feet, standing on the 2 feet, that you always, we're called to do that, to stand
Right.
and do.
Right.
So
And maybe it's that in that one about the little versus the great things, maybe it's that's always trying to stretch oneself, because the next thing we meet in life might stretch us a little bit more, and that becomes the greater thing. It might have started out little, but it became greater.
We had love is not idle. And since we have people from the soup kitchen at our table, we thought that was particularly appropriate.
Very
that
good.
they are obviously giving a faithful expression of love. We also had that you're drawn to love. And I think that we talked about whether that was an artistic thing, but more, it's kind of a laugh, but more in terms of how people really are drawn to people when you feel that sense of being cared for, of being acknowledged, of being seen.
And respected. Good. Okay. We'll be back again for more discussion. As Catherine's life unfolded, loving and living the 2 great commandments, she contributed to her own household. She nursed the sick. She cared for the poor. She accompanied the imprisoned and became a peacemaker among the cities of Tuscany and in the church. For Catherine, unity and peace were essential to her mission. Catherine lived in unsettled times in both society and the church. These times were somewhat similar to some of the challenges we face today, where true leadership is often questioned. There was insecurity, change and fear as the Middle Ages was ending and the Renaissance beginning. These times were marked by major and petty wars, illness, the Black Death, famine, loss of faith, corruption in society and church, etc. Today, we experience some similar themes: civil unrest, poverty and hunger, the plight of refugees and immigrants, greed and materialism, corruption, wars, economic disparities, ecological disasters, violence, and great polarizations in our society. I believe we have to learn from Catherine the power of transformation each one holds in that million voices she talks about, and using our voice. Catherine died in Rome in 1380 at the age of 33. She was declared a saint in 1461 and a doctor of the church in 1970. So let us shift a little bit now to envision the legacy of Catherine for leaders today. So a couple of questions for you to consider before we begin looking at Catherine and leadership. And just raise your hands for this little questions. Do you have a lot of confidence in our political leaders? If you do, raise your hands. Okay. Do you have a lot of confidence in our business leaders? Yeah, good. We got up a little bit there. Do you have a lot of confidence in our education leaders? We have a lot of teachers here, I hope so. And do you have confidence in our religious leaders? Whoa, that was very good, very good. A similar survey was done in 2007, and business and political leaders received 10%. Education and religious leaders received 20%, so they did a little better. We did really well around religious leaders, a tribute to Thomas More. However, all of us, when we look at those categories, know leaders in these sectors who we do admire, but we also know leaders in these sectors that we question. So take a moment to quietly think of a living leader that you respect. A living leader that you respect. This person does not have to be perfect. But the thing I want you to think about is, what personal qualities or attributes do you associate with this person? A living leader. And what we're going to share in a minute, just as a litany, are just the qualities and the attributes that you think this living leader has. Now, this one will be easier because it's just a collection of words. So, Jen, do you mind? Anybody? A quality or an attribute of a living leader that you admire?
I would say humility and capacity to know that you maybe make mistakes.
Bold and not afraid to speak up, even when there are others questioning or opposing your intentions.
Integrity and the ability to not judge people.
Moral.
Honesty.
Empathy and open-mindedness.
Over there.
Inclusivity and acceptance. Respect.
Deep faith and quiet, ferocious tenacity.
Kindness and compassionate.
Great. So now, from what you heard, these qualities and attributes, what ones do you associate with yourself? We're not going to share this. We're just going to take just a moment to think about this. Of what I heard, all wonderful qualities of a leader, what do you associate with yourself? For me, as a woman, a religious, and reflecting on Catherine and those leaders I have known, I would offer the following: call and self-knowledge. In her writings, Catherine presents a lot about a call to self-knowledge, which comes from her understanding of self, from her deep relationship with God, seeing herself as God sees her, and not what she wants to see for herself or how others want to see her, but how God sees her. For Catherine, this was a two-way mirror of seeing God as God sees her and seeing herself as God sees her. This is something we all strive for in becoming authentic persons that God created us to be. For me, this inner knowledge, a grounding in the spiritual life, gives breadth, courage, and focus to the life of a leader. It also keeps one grounded with a realistic, humble sense of self, knowing one's strengths and weaknesses and letting them both be part of one's leadership. This also keeps one other-centered, knowing leadership is not about me, but it is about those I serve. I also believe this grounding in knowing oneself makes one's leadership generative as we begin to prepare the next generation of leaders. In other words, being a mentor, as those women were in that play that I described in the beginning. Dominican Albert the Great, a great learner and teacher who taught both Thomas Aquinas and Meister Eckhart, said that the greatest joy of a teacher is when the student goes beyond the knowledge of the teacher, the day the student asks the question that I'm not sure what the answer is anymore. I believe this is also true for the leader who is grounded in self-knowledge and those two great commandments that we talked about in the beginning. I want to see other leaders develop and grow from my mentoring of them. Catherine says, love for our Creator cannot be sustained unless we love others for God's sake. And she says, one who knows more, who becomes more knowledgeable about self and the other, loves more. A second quality mentioned in the room already, courage. Another attribute of leadership we can learn from Catherine is courage, leading to purpose, the ability to influence, and finally to results. Catherine suffered deeply and was deeply criticized for her ministry efforts, especially her efforts to be a peacemaker. Yet, from her letters and her actions, we know she persevered to bring justice and peace to other people. A leader needs to be compassionate, willing to change when necessary. We're not always right. Willing to say, I'm sorry when I make a mistake. Flexible, a good listener, and speak the truth that comes from a life of contemplation, self-knowledge, study, and engagement with others. One needs to be able to share a vision that motivates others, but also to realize that that vision is only created with other people. We do not have all the answers. So the leader recognizes that the way we go about doing something is as important as what we do or the end result. So Catherine says, I treasure your knowing how to give the world a kick. We need lots of kicks today. She also says, a quote that somebody used from the table, love does not stay idle. We have to speak. We have to act. And she also says, another quote we already heard, do not be satisfied with little things because God wants great things. And I think in that passage she's referring to God wants us to stretch. Do not remain satisfied with where we are, but try to keep stretching ourselves to reach out and to be more for others. A third quality we find with Catherine, dialogue. Two famous quotes of Catherine speak to the need of dialogue and leadership. One is in our theme this evening. Speak as if you had of a million voices. It is silence that kills the world. And how true that is. The second quote is, speak the truth, but do this with charity. No one can hear us if we do not meet the other with respect and a willingness to engage their truth, which might be a little different from the way we are seeing things, and have an openness to be influenced by another's truth. Human contact, an eye, an ear, a voice, are so necessary for effective and transforming dialogue, something we cannot always achieve just through technology. We need the human contact of compassionate listening and understanding. Another quality we find with Catherine is to be a seeker of truth. From the example of Catherine, we know the importance of being a seeker of truth. Living in a time now when it is difficult to discern truth, given the many voices we listen to, one has to fall back on the gifts of study and discernment. When one studies, you learn more, your world becomes bigger, your understanding grows, we become more compassionate. And often that is followed by a desire, a greater desire, to be there for the other. As Catherine and we live in challenging times of unrest and questioning, it becomes more necessary for us to do our homework, to speak from knowledge, to act with compassion, and to love and have passion around what we hold dear in our hearts. Another quality of Catherine, justice and mercy. There's much going on in our times, and there was much going on in Catherine's times, that calls for one to seek justice, to speak for justice, and to act for justice. For a leader, justice and mercy go hand in hand and walk together, so that we truly respond to what is happening around us, not just knee-jerk reactions. And that helps us to be much more effective in understanding our neighbor and their concern. As Catherine says, make my heart big, not stingy. And in another passage, Catherine says to God in her dialogue, you are direct, without any twisting, genuine, without any duplicity, open, without any pretense. This is the spirit we desire to bring to issues of justice in our own day. And a couple of other qualities I find in Catherine and needed today. Humor and gratitude. These qualities, the sense of humor and gratitude, lift our hearts and lift our spirits and they do so for other people also. Humor is when we can hold ourselves lightly and enjoy some of the lighter things that happen to ourselves and to others, the more goofy moments in our lives. That side of ourselves is also nurtured by being connected with the earth. It's easy in these beautiful spring days that are coming upon us finally. And by being aware of all the beauty around us, natural beauty and the beauty that comes from being a participant in the arts. We need all of that to provide balance in our lives. And I also think that the leader today, as in Catherine's time, has to remember that the response of tears and laughter are both gifts of God to help us deal with anything that we have to face. And finally, gratitude. One important spiritual practice for Catherine, for a leader, I think, and for me, is that of gratitude. To begin and end one's day in gratitude helps us do that expansion that Catherine talks about in her writings. And she says in the dialogue, "You responded, Lord, you yourself have given, and you yourself answered and satisfied me by flooding me with a gracious light, so that with this light I may return thanks to you. With that light, I sense my soul once again becoming drunk. I am not advocating for drunkenness, but I am advocating for recognizing all the good things in our lives to balance some of the hard things that we have to face." So we're going to do one more short discussion at our tables. Reflect now, or try to think of someone you know, not someone you know about, who you believe to be a leader. They don't have to be perfect. How do they do it? What are the words you hear from them? What are the behaviors you see? And what are the actions they use that lead you to consider them a leader? So I'm going to give you a few minutes of quiet and then some time for discussion at your table. And then we'll gather some of the words, behaviors, and actions you observe in others who you consider to be leaders. These are the ones you know. So words, behaviors, actions. A little quiet, and then I'll invite you to talk at your table. So take a few minutes now and share at your tables what are some words you hear from people you think are leaders that you know, behaviors or actions you've observed. So let's see if we can bring our attention back. And Jen has the microphone again. So as you listened at your table, what were some words or behaviors or actions that people observed and who they consider have leadership qualities? Everybody has some. Anybody?
I thought of my friend who never says anything negative about someone else's character. If someone makes a mistake, it's never a testament of their character, but rather he tries to understand the situation that they're in and what circumstances could have led to less than a perfect or okay job. And I think that's something that I really value, realizing that I have never heard him or seen him ever he's never said anything negative about someone's character.
A remarkable person.
We talked about a leader needing to be a good listener and be a genuine listener also, but that also there needs to be a balance struck between listening to the opinions and criticisms of others, but also having some measure of confidence in the path you're leading people on, so that you aren't giving in to like popular opinion and focusing on yourself as a leader in an egotistical way, but instead focusing on servant leadership.
The Dominicans have this tradition, they call it disputation. And it's when we can not be in a debate with one another where there's a winner and a loser, but we can both sit down and talk. I can hear what you're saying. You can hear what I'm saying. I may be moved or I may not be moved in my opinions or my judgments, but at least I have listened to you and we have moved a little closer together in at least understanding one another. So it's a good practice, something similar to what you're talking about.
I think taking responsibility for failures in a personal way, a leader will never pass blame to other people, but will always first critique themselves before they start critiquing the members of their team.
And I think being able to say, I made a mistake or I'm sorry are important qualities in a leader because no one of us has it all. Anybody else?
Actually, Pat mentioned Chris George at Iris. Pat mentioned Chris George at Iris as exhibiting leadership qualities in growing his organization and involving so many people in helping immigrants and refugees. Someone we truly admire.
So someone who has a vision, who knows how to influence other people, and then you see results.
I think our own Father Bob is a great leader. Visiting the sick, commitment to things like immigrants, willing to work with staff until, in some cases, they prove that they can't do the job, and then at that point, he's willing to take a stand and make a change. He's an unusual priest.
And haven't we been blessed in this community?
Okay, so this is about my former boss who thought that God doesn't create junk, that there's nobody who is useless, that everybody is valuable in a way.
And everybody has a potential piece of being a leader in them. That's the other thing we have to recognize. Someone might have an appointed title. It doesn't mean they're the only leader in the place. They need all the other leaders to make it work. And therefore, nobody is junk.
For me, when I think of leader, I think of the leader of my family, my father, who was a teacher, not just as a profession, but in the house, teaching us, by his example of, how to be a good man, how to be a man of honesty, a man of compassion, a man who is faithful to God and his word, a man who just was approachable in every way, shape, and form for his kids, and just showing how to treat others with, honesty and integrity, and be a man, just be a person of good qualities.
And when you grow up with that example, it kind of eases into your being also. Anybody else? Well, thank you for that sharing. As we come to kind of the end of this time together, I did some of these more interactive things because I think you can talk about leadership, but or else you integrate it into yourself and recognize where it is in you. We can talk, but it's in the recognition and the integration of it into ourselves that's so important. So I think we recognize that genuine leadership in everything that everyone has said at their tables tonight, and in looking at Catherine and her example, that leadership is service. We can think of people like Pope Francis and Mother Teresa, and, as has been mentioned here, Father Bob, who lead by example. Often what we see them do is much more powerful than any word they say, even for preachers. So I hope that going through this brief journey and having these small discussions at our table help us all see Catherine in a little bit different way, but also see the lens of leadership that she provides for us. As she gave to us a way to look at self-knowledge and call, courage, the ability to dialogue, to be a truth seeker, to be just and merciful, and to have humor and gratitude. And I hope these can be guides for all of us. I know these attributes have been helpful to me over the years. But the most important thing in all of this is to be yourself, the one God created you to be. And that's in that you will find your own leadership. You'll find that you're called and you are a mirror of self-knowledge to God and to yourself. That God has given you the gift of courage, that God has inspired you to seek dialogue with others, or you wouldn't even be here tonight, but especially dialogue with people who challenge you. That God has made you a seeker of truth through study, through reflection, and through action. That God has ignited you to seek justice and mercy for those denied. Just listen to the things that this community does in the announcements every week. And that God has invited all of us to laugh a little bit and to be grateful for all the gifts of leadership that God has given us and that we have received from one another. As Catherine reminds us, if you are what you should be, you will set all of Italy, her reference, Yale, Thomas More, New Haven, you fill in the blank, ablaze. And in another passage, she says, to the servant of God, every place is the right place, and every time is the right time. So where you are on April 29th, 2018, the feast day of Catherine of Siena, is where you are called to draw forth the gifts of leadership that God has given you. And all we have to do is go do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sister Ann, and thank you, everyone, for sharing in our feast day of St. Catherine. And go out and be leaders.